Hello, everyone. Welcome into the Guilty as Charged podcast. I'm your host, Alex, for this video. No full shows this week since Stephen and Tyler are still on vacation until the 26th, which is when we will be recording next time for the live shows. But I did want to do a video today on an interesting ESPN Plus insider article that came out from Los Angeles football reporter Lindsey Thiry. Has done great work with the Rams and also the Chargers. She has been at minicamp and I believe OTAs as well, has been in some of these press conferences asking questions. So it's been around the Chargers, doing great work for them, covering them, I should say, in the offseason. So I did want to give her a shout out. And so this is her 53-man roster prediction early on. And I think it was worth talking about. So I did pull it up here on ESPN Plus. If you want to go read the full article, you can read it over there. But I sort of wanted to talk about what I agree with, what I disagree with, what sort of some of the tipping points are for, making this roster. And me and Tyler and Steven did a video about a month ago, I think after the draft, talking about, what the 53-man roster currently looks like right now, if we had to make it today. So I think all of these are going to be interesting conversations to, center the team around as we head into training camp. And as well as the preseason. And all these guys are going to be fighting for roster spots as well if they're not in sort of those top tier guys to make the team. But let's get this show on the road. And of course, the first position that we talk about in all of these projections is quarterback. And Lindsey here has the Chargers keeping Justin Herbert, Chase Daniel, and Easton Stick. I think this is what the Chargers will likely end up doing. To be honest, anyway. So not much discussion warranted here. I think there's always been the idea of cutting Easton Stick to maybe make one position a little bit deeper. And to be honest, because of the fact that the Chargers aren't getting much utility out of Stick anyway, I think that is the preferred route to go. But the Chargers have valued Easton Stick in the quarterback room. They have Chase Daniel as the backup, and I don't think that's changing this year. I think this is the final year of Easton Stick's contract as he was drafted in 2019. So this will probably be the last year that Stick is on the roster. But I think the Chargers have shown that they're very comfortable with this Herbert, Daniel, Stick quarterback room. So I do agree with Thiry on taking these three quarterbacks to make the roster. Probably the first disagreement I think many Chargers fans and analysts will have here. Lindsey does have Austin Ekeler, Joshua Kelly, Larry Roundtree, and Isaiah Spiller making the roster. I think for the most part, obviously we could talk about Letty Brown and Kevin Marks as undrafted free agents that maybe will impress the team like Austin Ekeler did back in the day. But this is probably how the four running backs will shake out. The interesting thing here is that Lindsey does have Gabe Nabers making the roster over one Xander Horvath, who the Chargers did take in the 7th round. Obviously has dynamic sort of dual threat potential as a runner, as a pass catcher for the position. I would be a little bit surprised if Gabe Nabers made the roster over somebody like Xander Horvath. It wouldn't be completely shocking. Again, the Chargers only spent a 7th round pick on Horvath. And maybe they end up cutting someone like Dean Leonard, who they actually picked around earlier just because they already have so many defensive backs. But personally, I think the decision to keep Nabers over Horvath would be very surprising unless Nabers just shows out in the preseason and training camp and Horvath doesn't. But based on what we currently know and the fact that Nabers was a relative non-factor last year, in healthy scratches, not really being utilized too much in the offense as it was, I think that Horvath would have to be the favorite for the fullback position. So I would disagree there, but I do agree that those are the four running backs the Chargers will end up keeping, and they will keep one of those fullbacks, whether it is Horvath or Nabers. Wide receiver. I actually completely agree with the 5 wide receivers that Lindsey has decided to keep in her projection here. I think this is pretty simple for the most part. Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, no chance they're getting cut. Both of them are making $20 million a year. Joshua Palmer and Jalen Guyton are going to play pivotal roles in this offense. I think they both see a step up in production as the wide receivers 3A and 3B, however you kind of want to order them. But those are going to be your guys, and DeAndre Carter is obviously here as a wide receiver and a punt returner, kick returner. specialist for special teams. We've talked a little bit about, is there potential chance for a wide receiver 6 to make the roster? But in terms of utility, I just don't see the Chargers getting the most value out of one. Jason Moore is a guy who's been on the roster for a while. Joe Reed, Trevon Bradford is the undrafted free agent they signed out of Oregon State to potentially make the roster as like that wide receiver 6 guy. But I think all of those guys at this point are fighting for more of a practice squad spot, especially because on the roster anyway, as currently constructed, they would likely be healthy scratches. So I just don't see any of those guys being good enough to compete for a wide receiver 6 spot or make it really necessary for the Chargers to keep one. So ultimately, wide receiver, completely agree on these being the 5 guys that they keep. Let's move on to tight end. We have Gerald Everett, Donald Parham, and Trey McKitty. Chargers obviously signing Gerald Everett to be in a little bit of that Jared Cook role that Jared Cook played last year. So I think he is your starting tight end. Donald Parham's your tight end 2, and Trey McKitty is back as your tight end 3. A couple of the guys that we've mentioned in the tight end room are Stone Smart, who actually impressed reportedly a little bit in minicamp last week. We have Eric Kromenhoek, and we do have what's his name? Hunter Camp Moyer as well. Sorry, I forgot his name off the top of my head. So I think you can make the argument for maybe one of those guys in the vein that the Chargers kept someone like Steven Anderson last year as a tight end 4, but I think they've made clear that their priorities on the roster are elsewhere a little bit in terms of the guys that they'll end up keeping. So for now, I think it's pretty evident that the Chargers probably only end up keeping 3 tight ends, and then the best between Kromenhoek, Smart, and Camp Moyer end up making the practice squad or something along those lines as well. Let's talk about offensive linemen. This is another position where I actually completely agree. I think that the offensive line, as much as the right tackle position is not set in terms of quality, and we can debate that until the cows come home, and we probably will be debating that until the cows come home, when the season starts. This is the group of 9 guys that will make the roster, just starting from your backups to your starters. Will Clapp is your backup center. Jamari Salyer is probably your backup right tackle / guard at this point, can do a little bit of both. Brendan Hymes is your backup guard. Trey Pipkins is a backup tackle at this point, although him and Storm Norton are obviously going to fight it out for that final right tackle spot. And then from right to left, obviously you have Zion Johnson, Corey Lindsey, Matt Filer, and Rashawn Slater as your starting offensive lineman as well. No real chance that anyone who's currently on the Chargers roster in a practice squad sense or like an undrafted free agent sense could make this roster. These are the 9 guys that they will end up keeping. Defensive linemen. We have Jerry Tillery, Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day, Braden Fajoko, Otito Ogbonya, and Morgan Fox in this roster projection. I think this is pretty accurate based on what we know. Just to this point, I do think this line is kind of interesting. Entering training camp, expect Tillery, Johnson, and Joseph Day to lead the way for healthy competition to take place behind them. So Tillery, you've heard it here first. Defensive tackle 1, which is probably actually true based on the fact that he is the pass rusher of the group between him, Austin Johnson, and Sebastian Joseph Day. But that is depressing to kind of hear based on his production last year. Of course, Braden Fajoko is sort of your defensive tackle 6, if you will. Otito Ogbonya, obviously, they drafted last year, so I think this will mostly kind of be a redshirt season from him, although I'm sure he will get some snaps and some action. And Morgan Fox, they kind of drafted to be the Tillery competition / backup behind him. So I generally agree that these are going to be these 6 guys that the Chargers end up picking for the roster. You can make arguments for other players as well. Joe Gaziano is someone who's flashed a little bit in the preseason. Forrest Merrill is kind of a fan favorite. But ultimately, I do think these are the 6 guys that they end up keeping, barring some injuries or something unforeseen. I think this outside linebacker ranking, or the 5 guys that Lindsey picks here, are pretty interesting. Joey Bosa, Khalil Mack, Chris Rump, Kyle Van Noy, as your 4 leading edge players. But then she picks Emeka Egbele as the 5th edge player. while probably true based on the roster, I don't see what real advantage Emeka Egbele gives you over someone like Jamal Davis or Ty Shelby out the gate yet. I also don't think that the Chargers really end up keeping 5 edge players, although I think that would kind of be an interesting thing in the Staley scheme based on how they run things. I think they felt comfortable keeping 4 last year with someone like Kyle Van Noy entering the room as your edge 3. I think they feel comfortable doing that probably again. And Emeka Egbele just didn't add a whole lot of value last year. I think he's fine as a guy who's been in the system, but he's really a practice squad player as opposed to a roster player that you're just going to kind of like burn a spot on. So barring injury and him getting elevated to the roster on any given week, I think Emeka Egbele is probably off the roster. And I actually will do a quick swap here as we talk about inside linebacker here in a second. Lindsey ends up keeping Kenneth Murray, Drew Tranquil, Troy Reader, Amen Agbagbemiga. I do think those are the 4 guys at linebacker they end up keeping. But I will say the interesting cut here is Nick Niemann. Nick Niemann is someone who played a pretty pivotal role on special teams last year. You have Ryan Ficken in the fold, who maybe will determine whether or not Nick Niemann fits in this current system. He's going to be able to determine the special teams personnel. But Nick Niemann got, Pro Bowl recognition and recognition around the league for his special teams performance last year. I think it's worth having him on this roster. And if you make me decide between, do I want to keep a 5th edge like an Emeka Egbele or like a Jamal Davis, or would I rather keep Nick Niemann to kind of bolster the special teams unit? I'm going to keep Nick Niemann and keep one of those 2 on the practice squad instead. So I do find it a little puzzling that Nick Niemann wasn't an automatic shoo-in to make the roster, especially because the Chargers did invest draft capital in him. And so I don't think they would just give up on him after 1 year, especially as a Staley pick and how pivotal he really was on special teams, even if he's not going to be a defensive linebacker starter in the rotation. I do think it's still pretty important to keep him. Let's get to cornerback. I don't think there's a ton to disagree with here. J.C. Jackson, Asante Samuel Jr., Michael Davis, and Bryce Callahan are obvious that is in some order your CB1 to CB4. And then in this configuration, you have Tavon Campbell and Jasir Taylor being kept as effectively CB5 and CB6. I think when it comes to those, the special teams contributions in particular will be interesting. And what guys obviously do in training camp in the preseason will matter a lot. Dean Leonard is a guy who has been, you mentioned in minicamp, as someone who's been getting pass breakups, someone who's been active. So it'll be interesting to see if any of that translates to the field. But as it currently stands, these are the 6 guys that I would also pick at cornerback to make the roster. There's not a whole lot else you could go with. I do think it is worth mentioning, though, Keemon Hall has been working alongside Jalen Guyton in that gunner role that Ryan Ficken is going to kind of implement after Ryan Smith left the team last year after tearing his ACL. So they do need someone else to be their gunner. If Keemon Hall can show enough value at that position, I don't think it's impossible that he makes the roster as a cornerback, although his special teams contributions last year were they left a little bit to be desired. But I do think it's worth mentioning him, potentially Dean Leonard, as guys that could make it on the back end when we're talking about CB6, right? If they're going to keep one of those guys. But I would give the nod right now to Tavon Campbell and to Jasir Taylor as well. So let's talk a little bit about safety. That brings us to Derwin James, Nasir Adderley, Alohi Gilman, and JT Woods in this projection for the Chargers. I don't really agree with Alohi Gilman getting the nod here over Mark Webb. Brandon Staley talked in minicamp about Mark Webb, said he would have a lot of competition, but that the Chargers do value his skill set a lot. If we're also just kind of doing the math on this a little bit, and I don't think it's real complicated math, Alohi Gilman was an Anthony Lynn draft pick, Mark Webb a Brandon Staley draft pick. I don't think that's like the only thing that ends up differentiating these guys. But I do think the Chargers have seen more that they liked out of Mark Webb, or at least the current coaching staff has, than they've seen out of Alohi Gilman. The counterpoint to that is that Alohi Gilman does have some special teams value, right? And has played on special teams, But I think based on what they see as athletic upside and what they see in potential, I think that they would favor Mark Webb in this current configuration over Alohi Gilman. So I would actually differ on that one. And then that brings us to what everyone loves talking about and what will be, for the first Chargers offseason in a while, a pretty boring conversation, right? The Chargers have always had someone who's like competing with Badgley, or maybe they have like a long snapper competition. Something happens to the punter. But this year is going to be pretty consistent. Dustin Hopkins is actually being challenged. Dustin Hopkins, who just signed a 3-year contract, is being challenged by Illinois Fighting Illini kicker James McCourt. I think it's pretty obvious that Dustin Hopkins is going to make the roster, so I say that kind of jokingly. Josh Harris, who they paid a lot of money to for a long snapper, to be their starting long snapper, he's going to make the roster. And right now, as it currently stands on the depth chart, if you wanted to look at it on a website like Our Lads or something else, J.K. Scott is the only punter that the Chargers really have. And so I think it's going to be interesting to see how that develops if the Chargers do feel the need to bring in another punter at some point down the road. But I think based on where we are in the offseason, they probably would have done that already. So I do think it's a little interesting that they haven't brought in any competition to this point. They have worked out the Aussie punter Ben Griffiths, who's come in a few times at training camp for tryouts and stuff like that. But he has not been signed by the team in any way. So right now, he's kind of a non-factor on the roster, although they did give him that tryout at minicamp. So we'll see if anything comes with that. But as of now, this is pretty decisively your 3 specialists. So I tend to agree with these picks as well. So honestly, this was a really pretty good 53-man roster projection for what I think will end up happening. I do kind of have Horvath over Nabers over here. And I think the running backs are pretty flexible in terms of Kelly and Roundtree and their value on the roster. Although I do think they will end up keeping all 4 of their primary running backs. I do think Letty Brown and maybe Kevin Marks are names to watch in the running back room to see if they have any flashes in the preseason like Austin Eckler did back in the day. I'm particularly high on Kevin Marks and his potential on this team if he is given a legit chance in the preseason to maybe crack the roster. But it's kind of big picture dreaming. I still think that the Chargers have a lot of running backs, and so I do think it's kind of hard for an undrafted free agent to get in this year. I do agree with the 5 wide receivers. I agree with the 3 tight ends. I think the best of Stone Smart, Cromanhook, and Camp Moyer will probably be left to the practice squad. The 9 offensive linemen are, as of now, completely correct, barring some kind of injuries happening. The defensive linemen, I actually agree with as well. I do think you can make arguments for someone like Gaziano, but I don't really think that there's a big fit here for anyone else to make an impact. Fahoko and Otito are pretty clearly the Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day backups / competition right behind them. And Morgan Fox is pretty clearly that for Jerry Tillery. So I think that is where we are with that. The trio of Tillery, Johnson, and Joseph Day will lead the line in the defensive line room, obviously. Outside linebackers, where I would disagree, I do think they end up keeping 4 edge players. I would be surprised if they kept a 5th, and I would also be surprised if that player was Emeka Egbele. We'll see if Tyler has any thoughts on that when he comes back to the podcast. But I don't think they end up keeping 5 edge players, especially if it were to come at the expense of potentially keeping Nick Niemann here, which I think is a pretty interesting omission from Thiry based on what his work was on special teams last year. But I do agree with the cornerbacks that Thiry ended up keeping here. Pretty cut and dry as of now, although somebody like a Dean Leonard or Keemon Hall could get involved for that like CB6 competition, although I don't really think they're big factors right now. And then at safety, I would probably pick Mark Webb over Alohi Gilman right now. But that is all of the disagreements I had. But overall, this was a really solid 53-man roster projection. Let me know what you guys think of this roster projection down in the comments down below. And I will see you guys next time.